I know this might sound crazy. I don't want to alarm you.
Guys, give it up for Jane Schoenbrun. We can clap for that. We can clap for that. Okay. Tell us about the origins of I Saw the TV Glow. This is about a teenager who discovers much about themselves through this a portal of a sort of a cultish late night TV show.
Yeah, it's about these two kids who are sort of outcasts in their suburban hometown in the 90s. And the place where they sort of feel most at home is in front of the television watching this TV show that, is this kind of like 90s phenomenon that I think still exists today, but definitely like the heyday of it was back then, this kind of like teens fight monsters and save the world kind of TV show, like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer or like a Goosebumps kind of energy.
Okay.
And these kids, they like really love this show and they really relate to the characters in the show, but their love for it like is so so intense that it's almost like a coping mechanism for kind of like getting through a childhood that doesn't feel quite right. And then the show gets canceled. One of the two of them disappears without a trace, and the film kind of jumps ahead to adulthood, and it becomes something that's maybe like a little more sinister or almost supernatural as we unravel like the mystery of this person's disappearance as it relates to the TV show. I'm a queer trans filmmaker. It's my second feature film. My first feature film, We're All Going to the World's Fair, which premiered at Sundance a couple years ago, was similarly about people sort of finding themselves through fiction, through sort of like horror and genre. And this film is very much like an extension of that film's themes and ideas, but about people who are, who don't feel like the world that they exist within is quite real or quite right. I wrote it while I was beginning to transition my gender, and I think the film very much comes from trying to articulate not only that feeling of like early transition as like an overwhelming emotional experience, but also like everything that led up to it, like half of a life spent sort of knowing that something is wrong subliminally and looking for the language to explain why. But it's exploring these queer themes in genre terms like my films tend to do.
Yeah, and it's getting such a passionate response from the festivals it's played thus far, and I feel like there are a lot of people out there that are seeing themselves in these characters. You talked about how personal it was to you in sort of the writing of it. Are you talking to other people who transition to sort of crowdsource experiences at all, or did you just maintain
I consider myself an auteur, and and so I tend to be a little bit of a control freak in the creating of the idea. I think my internal barometer is never like make sure. I try to stay away from thinking about like representation or good representation or bad representation. I think that's too much pressure to have on your shoulders when you're trying to make honest art. Thinking about like as a queer and trans filmmaker, obviously like there aren't a lot of folks making movies from that background and from that perspective, and so I do feel like a responsibility to do it well. But in my experience, the best way to make good art from like an honest place is just to trust what feels drawn from something personal. So I tend to just like hold myself to the standard of like, am I exploring something with this film that I know emotionally is like coming from a really vulnerable place, and from a place that I think the author Dennis Johnson always says "write naked," and that's not literally, but
or literally,
or both. Yeah. No, trying to like trying to put things on the screen that feel scary to say out loud, and if the films resonate with other people, it's I think exactly because they're kind of like not crowdsourced. They're personal and vulnerable in this way that has to come from sort of an internal process.
I love that you use these like cultish this like cultishly adored TV show as sort of the reference point, and in the references you cited, Buffy, Goosebumps I think was another one. In the writing process, did you sort of like revisit those? Did you spend a lot of time with those shows, and how did they sort of help inspire this specific tale?
I think I try to work from memory. So yeah, I definitely did like peek back at some of my favorite like Nickelodeon TV shows of my childhood. But I think it was much more a process of like trying to capture the feeling, not so much of like how they look when you put on an old episode on YouTube of Are You Afraid of the Dark in 2024 and just can sort of like see it from the vantage point of like, it's so dated, it's so cheesy, it's so cheap, but more so thinking about like how it felt to be 8 years old and seeing something that just like took you to another world in childhood, you know, growing up in the suburbs, growing up queer, growing up sort of like, I think quite disassociated from the world surrounding me, the real world surrounding me. I put so much of myself and so much love into the screen, you know, into my relationship with like these stories that I was watching on a screen, and I imbued them with such like magic as a kid that, you know, I would always say with this film, like, we're not trying to make a movie about how those shows actually looked. We're trying to make a movie about how it felt to watch them in that time and that place. And so, yeah, I think it was much more of like an intuitive process of like what sort of shines through in your memory, and sort of borrowing various like devices or tropes or aesthetics that just seem like so drawn from that subgenre, you know, this teens fight monsters subgenre of 90s television, but then almost like adapting or recontextualizing a lot of those tropes into like a contemporary like art film vernacular. It's something I also tried to do with my first film by taking like internet aesthetics and combining them with like the sort of the language of like the contemporary like art film, and I think something like really weird and kind of uncanny happens when you take like something that we think of as this cheesy old kind of like dated genre and try to take it really, really seriously in like a vernacular that that like we still sort of can understand as like articulating like a very different aesthetic.
Did you have any cinematic reference points? I've heard like early comparisons to Donnie Darko, The Craft. Were those reference points for you?
I'm always down for the Craft comparison. Yeah, I mean, I'm a cinephile and a film nerd and a film snob, and try to pull from everywhere. I think like I love slow cinema, and there is definitely a lot of language in the film that I'm borrowing from like maybe like Gus Van Sant in the 2000s or Gregor Rocky in the 90s, whose sort of like queer teen films are a very specific aesthetic that's always resonated with me. I think I definitely did know also with this film that I was like setting out to make like what I would call like a teen angst classic. You know, it's a film with like a banger soundtrack and lots of feelings, and just kind of like the kind of heart on your sleeve movie that like back in the day you would rent from the video store and then rent 8 more times and watch in basements with your friends. And so yeah, like Donnie Darko to me is like kind of the gold standard of that kind of like cult movie waiting in the new releases section for you to discover. So definitely was sort of pulling from a lot of those sorts of like early 2000s cult movies where I think there was much more of a culture at the time of like digging through the bin to find something that's like a little off the beaten path, but could be your new favorite movie.
And why I think South by will be another great launching pad for this film, because it's a festival that celebrates not only film and television, but of course also music. You teased the soundtrack to this and how integral it is to the film. Tell us a little bit more about the artists you have featured on this one.
Sure, yeah. I pitched A24 on doing a soundtrack that could sort of double as the soundtrack from the TV show within the movie, because such a big part of those 90s TV shows, you know, there was always like the Bronze on Buffy the Vampire Slayer or the Peach Pit on Party of Five, where every week for some reason, even though the show would take place in some small town in California, like whatever it band of the moment would be in that town playing their new single, you know, at the local club. And we basically collaborated on a list of artists, just, you know, like more emerging, contemporary, mostly queer musicians whose work I really loved. And I spoke with each of them and made each of them a mix and basically said to them, like, write the song that you would have played if you had played on one of those TV shows back in the day. And they all read the script, and we talked a lot about like the themes of the movie. And you know, I've been a mixtape maker from the youngest age, and it was definitely this cool opportunity to sort of like make a mixtape from from scratch. You know, the songs didn't exist yet, but I got to work with so many of my favorite artists to create something. You know, people like Caroline Polachek, Sloppy Jane and Phoebe Bridgers wrote a song for the film. Yule covers Broken Social Scenes anthems for a 17-year-old girl and is here at South by Southwest to perform it. Snail Mail, who's also in the film, does a cover of the Smashing Pumpkins' Tonight Tonight.
Nice.
Florist, Lorraine, Barty Strange, just like to me, like a real treasure trove of some of the most exciting artists getting started today.
Awesome. Well, again, huge congrats on the film and all the raves coming its way. I cannot wait to see it, and congrats on the South by premiere.
Thanks
as well.
so much.